Hello there, I'm Chris Johnston and I'm delighted to present research snapshot number 17 on behalf of PRECI, professionals and researchers in early childhood intervention. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from which I am speaking to you. I am on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. This is and always will be their land. The article that we are discussing today is titled Examining Early Childhood Expulsion Through a Trauma-Informed Lens. And as you can see, it's a very recent article, only being published this year. The authors are Chudzik, Courtney O'Grady, Lynn Burdick and Corr. Chose this article because there's a lot of interest in the area of trauma at the moment, both in terms of recognising the signs of trauma in children and in implementing trauma-informed care. This article, conducted in the United States, is a timely one for us to talk about. So what do we need to know? What do we need to think about? It's interesting that in this article they're looking at both trauma and expulsion from early childhood education settings and looking at the way that those two might influence each other. So they point out that children are more than 3 times as likely to be expelled from early childhood education settings than from kindergarten through grade 12. And I don't know about you, but I found that quite surprising until I started to think about the fact that once children do start compulsory schooling, it's harder for them to be expelled perhaps, although we know of course that it does happen. They also advise that exclusion disproportionately impacts boys, children of colour, children with disabilities and children who have experienced trauma already. Trauma is defined as an event or series of events that impacts a person's ability to cope, and that impacts them emotionally, cognitively, behaviourally, and or physically. The rates of trauma, they state, are high in early childhood, with estimates suggesting that up to 1 in 2 preschool-aged children experience trauma. And, we think about that in terms of child abuse, domestic violence, war, natural disasters, fires and floods, and of course intergenerational trauma. Previous research has found, however, that quality trauma-informed preschool positively affects child developmental outcomes. But, and it is a big but, they state that without sufficient training, educators may feel overwhelmed and unprepared to support children with challenging behaviour, and that this might lead to expulsion being seen as the only option. So what is this research about? This study was part of a larger project which examined caregiver experiences with expulsion in early childhood education settings. The research sets out to explore the ways in which the experience of early childhood expulsion contributes to the traumatisation of children and their caregivers, and where the child has already experienced trauma, the re-traumatisation of children and caregivers. Caregiver was defined as an adult who saw themselves in a primary caretaker role for a young child, for example, mother, father, foster parent, grandparent. And interestingly, what they did was to use a framework that was developed by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration to underlie the way that they approached the research. And the framework has 4 key assumptions. Firstly, that there's a need to realise the widespread impact of trauma. Secondly, a need to recognise the signs and symptoms of trauma. Thirdly, a need to respond by integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures and practices. And finally, to resist re-traumatisation. They also used an intersectional lens to further interpret the data, and that was the lens of disability studies and critical race theory. And in that theory, race, disability and ableism are seen as being built into the procedures, discourses and institutions of education. They are ever present. So what did the researchers do? This is a qualitative study that used semi-structured interviews, and they interviewed 26 caregivers and got them to talk about their experiences of suspension and expulsion in early childhood. The participants came from across the United States, with the vast majority identifying as white, middle class and female. They were between the ages of 26 and 48, and all said English was their primary language. So although an interesting and important study, I think it's not one that we can generalise to populations that might have a different cultural or linguistic background. Further research would be needed. 19 of the children were male and 22 had a disability. Interviews were conducted over the phone or by Zoom and lasted between 26 and 70 minutes. The transcripts of the interviews were analysed thematically using both deductive and inductive coding. So with respect to the deductive coding, they used the framework that I mentioned a little while ago to look for examples in the transcripts of those 4 key assumptions. And they used inductive coding to let the data speak to them and to identify additional themes that might be present. The coding was done by 3 researchers, and they then compared the way that they had coded the data. So that allowed them to ensure that there was consistency in the way that the data was interpreted. The participants were also sent summaries of the transcripts for checking, and they were able to make changes. Move on now and look at what the researchers found. And you'll see that what they've done is very helpfully give us a diagram which sets out their findings very, very clearly and shows how they align with the framework that they have used throughout the research. So in analysing the data, 3 main themes emerged, with each having 2 sub-themes. And what I'd like to do is just to give you an example, a quote from one of the participants for each of the sub-themes, so that you get a feel for the data and what they heard from the caregivers that they interviewed. So the first theme is early childhood education programs are unprepared to support children who have experienced trauma. And the first sub-theme under that one is understanding of children's behaviour. And one of the caregivers that they interviewed said this: "I think that there have been so many transitions that she is misunderstood. She's had bad behaviours over the years because she's with people who didn't understand her or didn't know that they were coping responses." The second sub-theme is classroom practices and policies. And in this quote, a caregiver is talking about how the setting responded when their child engaged in challenging behaviour. And the caregiver says they started this burying thing where they would grab those cushions and they would bury him into the middle until he was done with his meltdowns. If we look at those assumptions in that lower part of the diagram, you can see evidence in each of those quotes around the setting not recognising the signs and symptoms of trauma, not responding by integrating trauma-informed practices and policies, and indeed perhaps re-traumatising the child because of the way that they were responding. The second major theme was expulsion as a source of trauma for children and caregivers. The first sub-theme there is the impact of expulsion on children. And in this quote, a parent is talking about driving past the setting after the child had been expelled. And she said this: "A couple of times I drove by it with her. Even a year later, she cries and says she was a bad girl. I just stopped driving that way." And then the second sub-theme, looking at the impact of expulsion on caregivers. And this one is from a foster caregiver. And the caregiver says, "I remember feeling like maybe I can't do this. I thought I could be a mum for special needs kids, but I can't have childcare or have a break. I can't do this. Do I need to call and say I need to give one of them back? I can't do this without childcare. It was so stressful." So there you can see that there are aligning those two sub-themes, and indeed the theme, with re-traumatizing children and caregivers. The third theme is systemic issues causing trauma, and the first sub-theme there is navigating multiple systems. And the quote that I think we can probably all relate to in Australia is this one from a caregiver: "Everything was on me to figure out how to do it, what to do next, where I would take her. When you're trying to work and you're getting called to go and get your kid, it's hard." And then the last sub-theme is around ableism and racism. So looking at that intersectional lens, which uses that critical race theory and theories around ableism. And the first one around ableism, and the caregiver says, "I just couldn't believe all the stuff that I have to suggest. You've had kids with Down syndrome in this school before. All the things I'm suggesting are not revolutionary." And then a second one relating to racism, and here the caregiver says, "To me, I felt like I had watched other children who were not brown misbehaving or screaming at their teachers, and they would just be like, 'Okay, little Johnny, I'm going to call your mum.'" And there you can see that they are aligning those sub-themes and theme with realising the widespread impact of trauma, responding by integrating trauma-informed practices and policies, and resisting re-traumatisation of children and caregivers. So I think it gives a really good overview using that diagram of what it is that they found. Okay, so how can we use this research? Firstly, I think that we can use the framework to consider our settings policies with respect to suspending and or expelling children and the impact that this may have on children and families. We also need to be exploring opportunities for professional learning around trauma-informed practice and the signs and symptoms of trauma. And we need to be working to implement trauma-informed care as an essential part of family-centred and person-centred practice. I mean, it's very much at the heart of that. And finally, we need to be acting to ensure an inclusive and positive experience for all children and their families, knowing that this prepares them for success in future school settings. Okay, well, where to from here? Mia Chudzik and her colleagues have a number of papers that might be of interest, because as I said, this particular paper is from a larger project that they are engaged in. So you might want to take a look at those. And in addition, the article that I've been discussing is part of a special issue on research to practice in trauma and trauma-informed care in early childhood special education that's been published in topics in early childhood special education. So go there if you want to read some more. The researchers, Mia Chudzik, Lynn Burdick and Catherine Corr, are all at the University of Illinois, and Courtney O'Grady at the University of Alberta. The citation is there for you to follow up if you would like to, and thank you very much for listening.